There is a second Rick and Morty that almost nobody talks about. It built a Jerry who beat Rick in a fight. It sent the whole family into Dungeons and Dragons and stood them in front of an ancient cosmic horror. It gave a sleepy math teacher the keys to the entire multiverse. And it did all of this on paper, in comics that started 2 years after the show, and then quietly wandered off to do everything the screen never could. That gap between the show everyone knows and the comics almost nobody reads is what this video is about. Rick and Morty has been around for more than 10 years, and the talk almost always stays on the show. The nihilism, the science fiction, the jokes. What hardly anyone covers is the whole parallel world sitting on a comic shelf, full of villains, holidays, and crossovers that exist nowhere on screen, and the one strange moment the show reached back and borrowed from it. Tonight, we are walking slowly through all of it. Welcome to Ricktopus. If long-form analysis like this is your thing, subscribing is free, and it genuinely helps. Now, let us get into it, where the comics came from. For a little while, in the early part of the last decade, Rick and Morty was still a fairly small thing. The show arrived on Adult Swim on the 2nd of December 2013, made by Justin Roiland and Dan Harmon. And at first, it was just one more late-night cartoon sitting in a block of other late-night cartoons. The first season ran across that winter and into the following spring. People watched, then more people watched, and then word started to move the way it does when something is a little stranger and a little smarter than the things around it. By the time the first run of episodes had finished airing, the show had stopped being a quiet curiosity and had started becoming the kind of thing that fans talked about constantly, repeated lines from, and waited for with real impatience. That gap between seasons matters for the story being told here, because it is the soil the comics grew out of. Animation is slow. A season of a show like this can take a very long time to make, and the wait between one batch of episodes and the next can stretch on for what feels like forever to the people watching. Fans who had fallen for the world wanted more of it, and there were no new episodes to give them for long stretches. Into that hunger, a comic book made a lot of sense. It could come out every month. It could keep the characters moving while the animators worked. It could feed the part of the audience that simply did not want to leave Rick's garage. The company that ended up making those comics was Oni Press, an American publisher, and the first issue landed on the 1st of April 2015. The timing is worth sitting with for a moment. By then, the show had already aired its first season and had built a loud and loyal following, and a second season was on the way. The comic was not the thing that launched the world. The comic was the thing that arrived once the world already existed and already had fans waiting in line for it. That single fact shapes almost everything about how the two versions relate to each other, and it is the reason the usual order of these stories is flipped here. In most cases, a comic comes first, and a screen version follows. With Rick and Morty, the screen version came first, and the page came second, walking in behind a show that was already a hit. The comic was not a quiet, unofficial side project either. It was made in cooperation with the companies behind the show, with Cartoon Network and Adult Swim involved, so it carried the proper blessing of the people who owned the characters. That official stamp is part of why the comic was able to use the real family, the real garage, the real portal gun, and the real catchphrases without any trouble. From the very first page, it was allowed to look and sound like the genuine article. And yet, and this is the heart of the first big difference, the people writing and drawing it were not the people who made the show. Justin Roiland and Dan Harmon are listed as the creators of the characters, and their names sit on the comics the way a creator's name sits on any licensed work, but they were not the ones sitting down to plot each issue or write each line. That job went to a separate group of comic creators. The first stretch of the series was written by a cartoonist named Zach Orman. The early art came from an illustrator named CJ Cannon, with color work by Ryan Hill, and from very early on, a British comic artist named Mark Ellerby became one of the steady hands on the book, a name that would stay attached to the series for years and across many of its different corners. A little later, the writing reins passed to Kyle Starks, a comic creator from the southern part of Indiana who had earned a strong reputation in the comic world and who had been nominated for an Eisner Award, which is one of the most respected honors a comic creator can receive. Starks would go on to write a very large portion of the original run, and his time on the book is when a lot of the most beloved and most talked about comic stories were made. Different names came and went around them, a rotating cast of writers and artists, but the simple point holds. The comic had its own authors. It was its own creative effort, made by people who loved the show, but who were not the show. This is the cleanest way to understand what the comics changed. They did not change the show. The show kept doing exactly what it wanted to do, season after season, with its own writer's room and its own plans. The comics ran alongside it, made by a different set of hands, and because those hands were different, the comic version of this world slowly grew its own flavor, its own habits, and its own ideas about who these characters were and what they might get up to when the cameras were off. Two groups of people, both working with the same toys, were always going to build slightly different things. That is the engine that drives almost every difference covered in this whole essay, and it starts right here, with the basic fact of a separate team. The very first comic story sets the tone for how the book would approach the world. It carried the long and deliberately silly name, the Wubba Lubba Dub Dub of Wall Street, a play on the famous catchphrase that Rick blurts out, stretched into a joke about money and greed and high finance. Across its opening parts, the story did what the show loved to do, which was to take a familiar shape, in this case a tale about wealth and Wall Street, and twist it through the lens of a scientist who does not care about any of the normal rules. Right away, the comic showed that it understood the rhythm of the show. The humor was in the same key. The willingness to be strange was the same. The comic was clearly made by people who had watched closely and who got the joke. There was also a small structural choice in those early issues that says a lot about the comic as its own object. Each issue did not just contain one story. It usually carried a main story and then a shorter backup comic tucked in behind it. So a single issue might give a reader a longer adventure, and then, after that, a quick extra strip, sometimes by a different artist, sometimes focusing on a different character or a smaller joke. That backup slot became a little playground over the years. It was a place for side gags, for quieter character moments, for experiments that did not need to fill a whole issue. The show has nothing quite like that. An episode is an episode. A comic issue, in this run, was often two helpings in one, a main course and a small dessert. And that little format work is one of the first quiet ways the page experience differed from the screen experience. It helps to remember how licensed comics like this were often treated before Rick and Morty came along. For a long time, comics based on cartoons or movies or games carried a slightly tired reputation. Many comic fans treated them as throwaway products, cheap tie-ins meant to squeeze a few more coins out of a popular name, rarely worth taking seriously. That reputation was not always fair, but it was common. What happened with the Rick and Morty comics, over time, was part of a wider shift where these kinds of tie-in books started to climb back up in quality and in respect. And by many accounts, the Rick and Morty series sat near the very top of that climb. People who normally rolled their eyes at a cartoon comic found that this one was sharp, that the jokes were not softened, and that the creative team was genuinely swinging for something good rather than just filling pages. That respect is part of why the comic lasted as long as it did, and why so many different talented creators were happy to work on it. The connection between the show's makers and the comic was not completely cold, even if Harmon and Roiland were not writing the issues. When the early stories were gathered into bigger collected books, the show side lent a hand in small but warm ways. One of the hardcover collections of the early material, the one that gathered up a middle stretch of issues along with a separate side story, opened with a brand new introduction written by Dan Harmon himself, the show co-creator stepping in to say a few words about the comic version of his creation. That same collection even came packaged with a short sound clip voiced by Justin Roiland, a little audio treat tied to the book. So the bridge between the two camps existed. It just ran through forewords and bonus extras and blessings rather than through the actual scripting of the monthly issues. The show people waved at the comic and cheered it on. They did not steer it. All of this built up into something with real staying power. The first run of the main comic series did not come and go in a flash. It began in 2015 and kept going for years, issue after issue, eventually reaching its 60th issue before that first run came to a close in the spring of 2020. 60 issues is a long life for a licensed comic. Across those years, the book changed writers, changed some of its artists, changed its focus more than once, and grew a whole family of side stories and special miniseries around it. By the time the original run ended, the comic had built up a small library of its own, a shelf of stories that existed nowhere in the show and that fans could read in a completely different way than they watched the episodes. And then, after a pause, the comic did not stay gone. A second main series launched a few years later, in 2023, with a fresh start and a new lead writer, proof that there was still appetite for the page version of this world, long after the first run had wrapped. Around both runs sat a steady stream of separate miniseries and one-off specials, dozens of them across the years, each one its own little experiment. The comic, in other words, was not a brief stunt. It became a long-running, evolving thing with its own history, its own milestones, and its own creators who poured real care into it. So before getting into any of the specific changes, the picture worth holding on to is this. There is a television Rick and Morty, born in 2013, made by one group of people, and there is a paper Rick and Morty, born in 2015, made by another group of people, with the full permission of the first group, but with its own pens doing the work. The paper version came second. It arrived to feed a hungry fan base during the long waits between seasons. It was official, it was respected, and it ran for years and grew into a whole shelf of stories. Every single thing that this comic added, dropped, twisted, or quietly reshaped flows from that simple starting setup. Two teams, one world, a show that came first, and a comic that walked in behind it and then, gently, began to wander off in its own direction. That wandering is where the real surprises live, because the very first thing the comic did, once it had the keys to the world, was a choice so bold that it set the comic apart from the show in the most basic way possible. It decided, at the start, that the Rick and Morty on its pages would not even be the Rick and Morty from the screen. They would come from somewhere else entirely, and that decision is where the next part of the story begins. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. So the comics were born 2 years after the show, made by a separate team with the blessing of its creators, and grew into a long-running shelf of their own. Next, the boldest early choice of all, the secret that the first comics were never even about the family from the screen. Section 2. The alternate dimension. Beginning numbers sit quietly underneath the whole of Rick and Morty. Morty. They are easy to miss when watching, but they are always there. Every reality in the show has a label, a small code made of letters and numbers, like a license plate stuck on the back of an entire universe. Rick travels between these realities the way an ordinary person might walk between rooms. He opens a green portal, steps through, and arrives somewhere that looks almost exactly like home, but is, in some small or large way, different. Over the course of the show, this idea becomes one of its deepest ideas. There is not one Rick and one Morty. There are endless versions of them, spread across endless worlds, each one slightly off from the last. The most famous of these labels is the one tied to the show's main Rick. He is often connected to a reality marked as C-137, a code that fans came to treat almost like a name. When the show wants to remind everyone that its Rick is a specific Rick out of countless others, that code is the shorthand it reaches for, so the world already had a habit built into its very bones of pointing at a universe and giving it a number. That habit is the key that unlocks the strange and clever thing the comics did at the very start. When the comic team sat down to make their version, they faced a quiet but tricky problem. The show was still running. New episodes were coming. The writers of the show had their own plans, their own twists, their own surprises waiting in the wings, and none of those plans were shared with the comic team. If the comic told a big story about the family, and then the show told a different big story that contradicted it, the two versions would end up fighting each other. A reader might finish a comic where something major happened to a character, then watch an episode where that same thing clearly never happened, and the whole thing would feel broken. The comic could trip the show, and the show could trip the comic, and both would look clumsy for it. The solution the comic reached for was elegant, and it used the show's own rules to set itself free. Rather than claim to be telling the story of the exact same Rick and Morty from the screen, the early comic quietly announced that its Rick and Morty came from a different reality, not the famous C-137, a neighbor. The comic gave its world the label C-132, a number close to the show's own, but clearly not the same, and with that one small choice, it stepped sideways out of the show's path. The Rick on these pages looked like the Rick on the screen. He sounded like him, he drank like him, and insulted Morty like him, and dragged the family into danger like him. But he was, by the comic's own word, a separate man living in a separate world. This was a deliberate move, made for a reason, that the people involved have explained plainly over the years. Setting the comic in its own dimension removed the worry about continuity. It meant the comic writers did not have to check their stories against whatever the show might do next, because their stories were simply happening somewhere else. If the comic blew up a planet, or killed off a character, or changed something forever, none of it touched the show, and none of the show's surprises could reach back and ruin the comic. The two could run side by side without ever stepping on each other. That freedom was the whole point. A separate reality gave the comic team room to breathe and room to play. There is something almost poetic in how natural this felt inside the world of Rick and Morty, though that word should be used carefully. The trick worked so smoothly because the show had already trained its fans to accept exactly this kind of thing. In a normal story, telling the audience that the heroes are actually different people from a different world would feel like a cheat, a way of wriggling out of the rules. Here it felt like business as usual. The show itself moves its characters between realities. The show itself has had its family treat alternate versions of themselves as ordinary facts of life. So when the comic said its Rick was a C-132 Rick rather than a C-137 Rick, longtime fans did not blink. They understood the language. They knew that in this world a slightly different number simply means a slightly different branch of the same tree. The effect of that choice ran deeper than just dodging conflict. By giving itself a separate home, the comic was able to feel like its own thing, rather than a mere shadow of the show. A tie-in that only ever retells safe, small stories, careful never to touch anything important, can start to feel pointless, like a copy that is afraid to do anything the original has not already done. The comic avoided that trap by claiming a world where it was allowed to matter. Inside C-132, the comic's events were the real events. Nothing was off limits, because nothing in C-132 could be overruled by an episode. The page became a place where consequences could actually stick, at least within its own borders, and that gave the early stories a freedom that a more timid tie-in would never have enjoyed. The very first comic story, the long jokey tale about Rick and a Wall Street-style world of money and greed, lived inside this separate reality. So did the stories that followed it through the opening stretch of the series. Across those first two collected volumes, the adventures belonged to the C-132 family. They're Jerry, they're Beth, they're Summer, they're Morty. All of them were the neighbors rather than the originals. They carried the same names and the same faces and the same broad personalities because they were branches of the same characters, but the specific people on the page were the comic's own. Even the family members beyond Rick and Morty were tied to that C-132 label in those early books, which shows how complete the separation was. The comic did not just swap out the two leads, it moved the whole household into a world of its own. What is interesting about this period is how confident it was. The comic did not treat its separate dimension as an apology or as a way of saying that its stories did not count. The early books simply got on with telling adventures, full of the same energy and the same dark humor that fans loved on screen, never pausing to fuss too much over the gap between page and show. The C-132 framing sat in the background like a quiet safety safety net. There, if anyone needed to think about it, ignorable if they did not. A casual reader could enjoy the stories without ever worrying about which Rick they were watching. A careful reader could notice the label and understand the clever reason behind it. Both kinds of reader were served at once. It is worth slowing down to appreciate just how unusual this kind of opening is for a licensed comic. Most tie-in books, when they begin, simply pretend to be a seamless part of the thing they are based on. They want the reader to feel that the comic is just more of the show. No seams, no asterisks. The Rick and Morty comic did something different and a little braver. It told the reader, more or less openly, that this was a parallel version, a cousin rather than a twin. That honesty was made possible only because the source material was about parallel versions in the first place. A comic based on almost any other show could not have pulled this off without confusing everyone. Here, it fit the world like a glove. The separation also quietly protected the show in a way that is easy to overlook. The show's creators had a real interest in keeping their biggest story beats for the screen. The deepest secrets about Rick, the most painful turns for the family, the long, slow reveals that the show would dole out across many seasons, all of that was the show's treasure to spend when and how it wished. If the comic had been telling the story of the true C-137 Rick, it might have stumbled into that treasure by accident. Or worse, it might have been forbidden from touching any of the interesting parts in order to leave them safe for the show. Setting the comic in C-132 untied that knot. The comic could explore its own version of the characters freely, precisely because its version was not the one carrying the show's buried gold. Everyone won. The comic got freedom, and the show kept its secrets. And yet, for all its cleverness, this separate dimension beginning did not last very long in the grand scheme of the comic's life. Only the first 2 volumes truly belonged fully to C-132. The early run set up this neat little world apart, told its opening adventures there, and built the comic's voice inside that safe and separate space. Then, fairly soon, the comic made a second big decision that pointed it in nearly the opposite direction. Having gone to the trouble of building its own dimension, the comic chose to close the gap and step toward the show after all. That turn is one of the most important shifts in the entire history of the comic, and it changed what the book was trying to be. Before reaching that turn, though, the C-132 era deserves to be remembered for what it was, because it is the purest example of the comic going its own way. At no other point would the comic ever be quite so openly and proudly separate from the show. Later stories would tangle themselves up with the show's continuity, would reference real episodes, would try to slot into the spaces between things that happened on screen. The opening volumes did none of that. They simply set up shop in a universe next door and got on with the work. For that brief window, the paper Rick and Morty was not even claiming to be the same Rick and Morty. It was a confident, self-contained thing, a cousin universe with its own family and its own troubles, free of the show in the most complete way the comic would ever manage. The reasons behind the choice show a creative team thinking carefully rather than just slapping the show's name on some pages. A lazy tie-in would not have bothered with a separate dimension at all. It would have grabbed the famous characters, ignored the question of continuity entirely, and hoped no one noticed the contradictions. The decision to mark the comic's world as C-432 reveals people who understood the show deeply enough to know that continuity would become a problem, and who were clever enough to solve that problem using the show's own logic. That care is part of why the comic earned the respect it did. The very first creative decision in the whole run was a smart one, made by people who clearly loved the thing they were working on and wanted to do right by it. For fans coming to the comics for the first time, especially fans who only know the show, this early choice can be a small surprise. There is a natural assumption that a comic based on a show must, of course, be about the very same people from that show. With Rick and Morty, in the beginning, that assumption was simply not true. The leads of the opening comics were stand-ins from a neighboring world, close enough to feel right, separate enough to keep the peace. Knowing that small fact changes how those early stories read. They are not gaps filled in around the episodes. They are dispatches from somewhere else, a place that looks like home but is its own home, with its own version of every face. That little world apart, sealed off by nothing more than a slightly different number, is where the paper version of Rick and Morty truly began. It was a safe harbor, chosen on purpose, built so the comic could find its feet without fear of the show. And once the comic had found those feet, once it had grown sure of its own voice inside that harbor, it made a choice that pulled it out of the safe water and pointed it straight at the show it had been so careful to avoid. The comic decided, in its third volume, to stop being the story of a neighbor. It decided to become the story of the real family from the screen. And the moment it made that turn, everything about how the comic related to the show changed. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. So the earliest comics quietly stepped into a world next door, a reality marked C-132, set apart on purpose so the page could roam free of the show. Next, the great turn. The moment the comic abandoned its safe harbor and claimed the real family from the screen as its own. Section 3. The canon merge from Volume 3 around the second year of its life. The comic did something that surprised the quiet logic it had built for itself. It had gone to real trouble to carve out a safe little corner of the multiverse, a world called C-132 where it could tell any story it liked without ever bumping into the show. That corner worked. It gave the early books their freedom and let the creative team find their voice. And then, having built the safe room, the comic walked out of it. With the third volume, the series turned around and pointed itself straight back at the show it had been so careful to stay away from. The change was not a small tweak. It was a shift in what the comic claimed to be. Up to that point, the pages had followed the family of a neighboring reality, close cousins of the screen characters, but not the screen characters themselves. From the third volume onward, that gap closed. The comic now said, in effect, that it was telling the story of the genuine article the same Rick and Morty fans knew from television, the ones tied to the famous C-137 label. The neighbors stepped aside. The originals stepped in. The book stopped being a tale from somewhere else and became, by its own account, a set of extra adventures belonging to the real family. This is roughly the same stretch of time when the writing of the series passed into the hands of Kyle Starks, the Indiana comic creator who would go on to shape so much of the original run. His arrival and the canon shift sit close together in the comic's history, and together they mark the moment the book grew into its mature form. The early Gorman era had set up the world and the tone. The Starks era took that foundation and aimed it at the show, and a great deal of the comic's most loved material flows out of this period, once the page and the screen were finally claiming to be parts of the same story. The idea that powered the new approach is a gentle and appealing one. A television show, by its nature, can only show so much. An episode lasts about 20 minutes. It picks one adventure, tells it, and ends. But the characters supposedly live full lives in between those chosen adventures. Rick is always tinkering. Morty is always being dragged along. The family is always getting into trouble that the cameras simply never happen to catch. The merged comic offered itself as a window into exactly that unseen space. It would show the adventures that fell between the episodes, the trips and disasters, and strange afternoons that the show never had time to air. For a fan who never wanted the world to stop, that promise was a warm one. The comic became the place where the family kept moving, even when the screen went dark. To sell that promise, the comic began to treat the show's events as real history. Where the early C-132 books had floated free, the merged books started to nod toward things that had genuinely happened on television. Episodes that fans had watched were now treated as part of the comic's own past, points on a shared timeline that both versions could lean on. A reference here, a callback there, a sense that the comic knew what the show had done and was building on top of it rather than off to the side. That web of nods is the clearest sign of the merge. The comic was no longer pretending to be a separate world. It was reaching across the gap and shaking the show's hand, saying that the two of them remembered the same things. From that point, the policy held steady for the rest of the comic's existence. Almost everything published from that turn onward was meant to sit inside the show's continuity rather than apart from it. The later volumes of the original run, all the way through to its 60th and final issue, carried this shared canon idea. The revival that came years afterward carried it too. So the C-132 experiment, for all the attention it deserves, covers only the opening chapter of a much longer book. The vast bulk of the comic, by page count and by years, belongs to the merged era, the era where the page and the screen agreed to be one story told in two places. There is, however, a soft and honest catch tucked inside this whole arrangement, and it is one that thoughtful fans and writers have pointed to many times. Saying that the comic and the show share a single canon sounds like a big and solid claim. In the world of Rick and Morty, it turns out to be a surprisingly loose one. The reason is the very thing that made the C-132 trick possible in the first place. This is a world where characters slip between realities constantly, where versions of people are swapped out without ceremony, where the show itself rarely cares to keep a tidy, unbroken line of events. The show breaks its own rules for a joke. It has changed which exact reality the family even lives in. It has killed its leads and replaced them with near copies from down the multiverse without making a fuss. When the underlying world is that slippery, the promise that two stories share one canon does not carry the weight it would carry in a stricter universe. So the merge, in practice, is a gentle thing rather than an iron law. The comic claims to share the show's history, and it makes the gestures that back up that claim. But nothing about the world demands that the two line up perfectly, and nobody involved seems to lose sleep when they do not. Both the show and the comic hold the same loose attitude toward the idea of a clean, unbroken story. Both are happy to bend their own past for a good gag or a strong moment. Because of that shared looseness, the question of whether a given comic truly happened inside the show's world ends up mattering far less than it would anywhere else. The honest answer many readers land on is that it does not really matter much at all. The comics can be enjoyed as part of the show's world or as their own thing, and either way of reading them works. That softness is not a weakness. It is part of the charm, and it is part of what kept the comic free even after it gave up its separate dimension. By merging with a canon that was never strict to begin with, the comic got the best of both choices. It gained the feeling of connection, the warm sense that these were the real characters, and that their comic adventures counted. Yet it lost almost none of the freedom it had enjoyed in C-132, because the canon it joined was so relaxed that it could still do nearly anything it wanted. A strict shared canon would have chained the comic to the show, forcing every page to obey every episode. The loose shared canon of Rick and Morty placed almost no such chains at all. The comic could claim claim the real family and still go wild. It helps to picture the difference in simple terms. In the first 2 volumes, the comic stood in a separate building, with its own address, never touching the show's house. After the merge, the comic moved into a room in the show's house, but the house turned out to have moving walls, doors that lead to other houses, and a family that often forgets which rooms they have already been in. Living under the same roof as the show sounded like a tight arrangement. In a place built like that, it barely tied the comic down at all. The comic could share the address and still wander wherever it pleased. For all the philosophy of it, the practical result was a richer set of stories. Once the comic was telling tales about the real family, it could lean on everything fans already felt for those characters. A reader did not have to wonder whether to care about this Beth or this Summer, because the comic was offering the Beth and the Summer they already knew and loved. The emotional shortcuts that come with the genuine cast were now available to the comic, and the creative team used them. Stories could reach for real feeling, because the people on the page were the people the audience was already attached to. The merge traded a little distance for a lot of warmth, and in a series about a family, that warmth was worth having. The merge also opened a door that the C-132 era had kept shut, and through that door came the most interesting kind of moment this whole essay is built around. Once the comic and the show shared a history, it became possible, at least in theory, for traffic to flow both ways. The comic had always borrowed from the show. That was never in doubt. But a shared canon raised a tantalizing question. Could the show ever borrow from the comic? Could something invented on the page by the separate comic team ever cross over and show up on the screen, treated by the show's own writers as real? In the world before the merge, that idea would have been almost unthinkable, since the comic lived in a different reality entirely. After the merge, with both sides claiming one history, the door at least stood open. For a long stretch, that door mostly stayed where it was, open but unused. The show is a proud and self-contained thing, with its own writers and its own plans, and it had little reason to dig through the comic's pages for ideas. The flow of borrowing ran almost entirely one way, from screen to page, as it had from the very beginning. The comic took the show's characters, the show's catchphrases, the show's events, and built on them. The show, busy with its own seasons, paid the comic the respect of forewords and bonus clips, but generally kept its stories to itself. The merge made a two-way street possible without actually filling both lanes with traffic. And then, in one small but unforgettable instance, a car drove down the other lane. The comic, during its merged era, created a character and a storyline so striking that the show, when it later made one of its most celebrated episodes, slipped in a quiet nod to it. A single reference, easy to miss, but there for anyone paying attention. A wink from the screen back at the page, an acknowledgement that something the comic team had dreamed up had been seen, remembered, and quietly welcomed into the show's own sprawling world. That moment is the rarest thing in the relationship between these two versions, and it is the strongest proof that the merge in the third volume truly meant something. It turned the comic from a separate cousin into a genuine part of the family, real enough that the show itself was willing, just once, to reach back and touch it. That single nod points straight at a character the comic invented out of an accident, a figure who began as a typo in an email and grew into one of the most beloved creations the comic ever produced. He is cruel where his namesake is gentle. He is brilliant where his namesake is foolish. He beat the one man in the multiverse who is never supposed to lose, and he is where the comic's invented world first reached up and touched the screen. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. So with its third volume, the comic left its safe harbor and claimed the real family from the screen, joining a canon so loose that it stayed free anyway, and quietly opening a door for the show to borrow back. Next, the accident that became a legend, the comic-only villain who once made the show itself look his way. Section 4. Doofus Jerry and the Tale of Two Jerrys. In nearly every corner of the multiverse, Jerry Smith is the one who comes up short. That is part of the quiet rule the show built around him. Across countless realities, in version after version, Jerry is the soft one, the foolish one, the man who means well and fails anyway. He is the husband Beth half regrets marrying. He is the father his children gently pity. He is the easy target for Rick, the punching bag whose biggest dream is usually something small and a little sad. Wherever the story goes, whichever Jerry it finds, the pattern tends to hold. Jerry loses. Jerry is loved in spite of himself, if he is loved at all, and he almost never wins. The comic took that rule, looked at it carefully, and then broke it in the most memorable way it ever managed. It asked a simple and slightly chilling question. What if there were one Jerry, somewhere out in the endless branches of the multiverse, who did not lose? What if there were a single Jerry who had everything the others lacked? The intelligence, the drive, the cruelty, the will to take what he wanted and crush anyone in his way. The comic answered that question with a character who became one of its proudest inventions, a villain born from an accident, and one of the very few comic creations the show itself would ever look back at. His name, in the world of the comic, is Doofus Jerry, and the name is a small joke that turns into a much darker thing once the character actually arrives. He comes from a reality with one of those long, tangled codes the show loves, a dimension labeled J19 Zeta 7. He shares that home with another familiar oddball, the gentle and clever Doofus Rick, the sweet-natured Rick the show had introduced as a kind of harmless outcast among his own kind. The naming sets up an expectation. A doofus Rick is a soft, friendly Rick, the one the other Ricks make fun of. So a doofus Jerry, by the same logic, ought to be even softer, even more harmless, the gentlest version of the gentlest character. The comic uses that expectation to set a trap, because doofus Jerry is anything but harmless. In his home reality, he is the most successful man alive, the ruler of his own world, a figure described in the comic as the literal definition of success. He conquered his Earth. He became its richest and most powerful person, and he did all of it without a drop of the warmth that defines every other Jerry. This Jerry is cold. He is ruthless and greedy and violent, a man with no real care for anyone around him, who treats other people as things to be used or removed. He cannot stand rejection. When someone tells him no, his answer is force. The comic paints him as a sociopath in a sweater vest, a man wearing the soft, familiar face of the family loser while carrying the heart of a tyrant. The gap between how he looks and how he behaves is the whole engine of his menace. The way he was created is one of the most charming behind-the-scenes stories in the comic's history, and it shows how much of art is luck. By the account of the people who made the book, Doofus Jerry was born from a mistake. The writer of that era, Kyle Starks, was trading emails with the comic's editor about a story idea involving Doofus Rick, the sweet outcast Rick everyone already knew. Somewhere in the typing, Doofus Rick became Doofus Jerry, a simple slip of the fingers, one name swapped for another by accident, and rather than correct it and move on, the team paused on the strange new phrase they had stumbled into. Doofus Jerry, two words that should not go together. A whole character seemed to be hiding inside the error, waiting to be let out. From that small typo grew 3 full issues, and one of the comic's most beloved villains. The editor would later remember the moment as one of her favorite little bursts of creativity on the entire book. The story that the accident produced is called A Tale of Two Jerrys, and it ran across a stretch of issues starting near the end of 2016, during the comics merged era, once the book was already telling tales about the real family. It begins, fittingly, with the ordinary Jerry feeling small. The family doubts him. Morty comes home one day with a scar on his forehead and a tall tale about a fight, when really he just walked into a door while distracted. Jerry, trying to share in the moment, claims the boy gets his fighting spirit from him, and the whole family quietly laughs at the idea that Jerry has ever been in a fight in his life. Stung and embarrassed, he wanders off, and his eye lands on Rick's portal gun. What Jerry does with that portal gun is go looking for comfort in the one place he feels welcome. He travels to visit his friend Doofus Rick, the kindly outcast, hoping for a calm afternoon among the few beings in the multiverse who treat him decently. The two of them set off to enjoy a simple day, the sort of harmless outing the gentle Doofus Rick adores. And it is during that innocent trip that everything goes wrong, because the security forces of that world spot them and drag them before the local ruler. The ruler turns out to be Doofus Jerry, sitting at the top of his conquered Earth, staring at a face that matches his own. The meeting is the hinge of the whole arc. The ordinary Jerry, shocked to find a version of himself who rules a planet, blurts out the truth about the multiverse without thinking. He hands the dangerous man the one idea that will set the rest of the disaster in motion. Doofus Jerry, who until that moment had only his single world to rule, suddenly learns that there are endless worlds, endless versions of everything, an entire multiverse waiting to be taken. The hunger in him wakes up at once. He offers the ordinary Jerry a trade, a swap of lives, and for a flickering moment, the soft Jerry is tempted by the chance to be someone who wins for once. He refuses in the end. His refusal earns him a beating, and Doofus Jerry takes the portal gun by force, leaving the gentle Doofus Rick stranded and helpless. With a stolen portal gun and a newfound knowledge of infinite worlds, Doofus Jerry steps into the family's reality, and here the comic does something genuinely unsettling. He arrives in the home of Rick and the Smiths, and rather than being swatted aside like every other Jerry, he charms his way in. He wins over Beth almost instantly, a thing the ordinary Jerry could never reliably do, and he begins to settle into the family as though he belongs there, all while plotting something far larger. The version of Jerry, who is supposed to be beneath everyone's notice, walks into the most dangerous household in the multiverse and starts to take it over from the inside. Then comes the part that fans remember most, the part that flips the deepest rule of the entire franchise. Rick Sanchez cannot beat him, the smartest being in the universe, the man who wins every fight, who outthinks gods and monsters and his own worst impulses, runs straight into a Jerry he simply cannot defeat. Rick tries everything. He schemes, he fights. At one low and very silly point, he resorts to throwing a cat at the man, out of sheer frustration. He grows so desperate that he prepares to set off a devastating bomb just to be rid of the problem, and Doofus Jerry calmly reveals that he has already disarmed it. Rick, who explains to Morty that he and Jerry sit at opposite ends of a natural order, the predator and the prey, the winner and the loser, is forced to admit that this particular Jerry is a crack in that order. An exception, an anomaly that should not exist. For once, the prey has become the predator, and Rick has no answer for it. This Jerry, the comic tells us plainly, holds a record that belongs to no other version of him anywhere. He is the only Jerry in the entire multiverse to beat Rick Sanchez of C-137 in a fight. Sit with how strange that is inside this world. The whole tragedy of Jerry is that he is the man Rick Rick's defeat without effort. To be the single Jerry who turned that around, who looked the unbeatable Rick in the eye and won, places Doofus Jerry in a category all his own. He is the proof that even the firmest rule of this universe can bend if the right impossible thing comes along. The arc climbs higher still. With Rick out of his depth, the threat grows beyond one household. Doofus Jerry sets his sights on the great gathering place of the Ricks, the Citadel, the vast secret city where countless Ricks and Mortys live together. And for a brief, astonishing window across the back half of the story, a Jerry conquers it. The man the entire multiverse looks down on takes the throne of the Ricks themselves, ruling their city under a grand and ridiculous title, Master of the Multiverse. The king the Ricks never thought to fear, the deepest joke of the franchise, the eternal loser, becomes, for a moment, the ruler of the very beings who built their whole identity around being smarter than him. The comic lets that image breathe before, in the end, the threat is finally brought down and the order of things is uneasily restored. Now comes the moment that makes Doofus Jerry matter to the larger story being told tonight. The show, as a rule, keeps to its own ideas and rarely borrows from the comic. But not long after the comic published this arc, the show aired one of its most acclaimed episodes, a deep and ambitious story set inside that same citadel of Ricks and Mortys. And tucked somewhere inside that episode, easy to miss among everything else happening on screen, the show placed a small nod to Doofus Jerry, a reference, a wink, an acknowledgement that the comic team's accidental villain had been seen and remembered by the people who made the show. Sources that track the two versions point to this as the clearest case of the screen reaching back to touch the page. A character who began as a typo in an email had traveled all the way from the comic into the show's own most celebrated tale of the Citadel. The traffic, for once, flowed the other way down the street. That single nod carries a lot of weight. It is the comic's proudest moment in its long relationship with the show. Every other day of that relationship, the comic borrowed from the screen. On this one occasion, the screen borrowed from the comic. The accident had become real enough, beloved enough, and clever enough that the show itself was willing to fold it into its own world. For a tie-in comic made by a separate team, that is about as high an honor as exists. The original creators looked at what the comic had built and decided it was good enough to keep. Doofus Jerry did not stay gone either. Years later, when the comic relaunched for its second run, he turned up again, revealed to still be alive, and gathered among Rick's old enemies for a great brawl, crossing blades with another strange figure before slipping away with his fate left unclear. He also resurfaced in the special material the comic produced to mark its 10th anniversary, proof that the character had become a permanent fixture of the comic's world rather than a one-time guest. The accident had grown roots. He had become someone the comic could call back whenever it wanted a Jerry the audience would actually fear, and in the years since, he found a strange second life online, where short clips and edits made him popular all over again with people who had never read the original issues. The whole tale of Doofus Jerry sits at the very center of what the comic was able to do that the show, in its busy seasons, never quite did. A separate team, free to play, took the saddest running joke in the franchise and turned it inside out, building a villain so good that the original creators tipped their hat to him. It is the comic at its most confident and its most inventive, a story that could only have come from people willing to ask a question the show never paused to ask, and lucky enough to fumble the right name into an email. Yet for all his menace, Doofus Jerry is still a villain, a threat to be beaten. The comic's gift for taking the show's overlooked figures and giving them more was not limited to making monsters out of them. Sometimes the comic looked at a character the show used for a single strange scene and decided, gently, to hand that character an entire adventure of their own. One of the show's most beloved oddities, a sweet little figure with an unforgettable name, got exactly that kind of spotlight, and it is where the comic's kinder instincts shine. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. So a slip of the fingers in an email gave the comic Doofus Jerry, the one Jerry to ever beat Rick, the loser who briefly ruled the Citadel, and the rare comic creation the show itself reached back to greet. Next, the comic's softer talent, the way it handed whole adventures to the little side characters the screen only ever borrowed for a moment. Section 5. The side characters the show left behind. Some characters are built to stand near the edge of the picture. They are not the stars. They wander in for a scene, land a joke or a strange little moment, and then the camera moves on without them. A long-running show collects a great many of these figures over the years. A whole crowd of faces who appeared once or twice, made an impression, and were never really seen again. Most of them stay where the show left them, frozen in the single moment that introduced them, half-remembered and rarely missed. The comic looked at that crowd of forgotten faces and saw something the show had not bothered to use. It saw stories waiting to happen. There is a softness to this part of the comic's work that sits in gentle contrast to the cruelty of a villain like Doofus Jerry. The comic did not only invent monsters out of the show's overlooked corners. More often, it acted like a kind caretaker for the characters the show had set aside, picking them up, dusting them off, and handing them the spotlight they never got on screen. A figure who existed only as a quick gag in a single episode could walk into the comic and suddenly find an entire adventure built around them. The page became a second home for the show's leftovers, a place where being a minor character was no barrier to being a lead. No No example of this shows the comic's kindness better than the miniseries built around one of the show's strangest and most beloved oddities. A small, cheerful figure with a name too rude to say lightly and a heart far bigger than his screen time. Mr. Poopy Butthole. To understand why giving him his own comic mattered, it helps to remember how he came to exist on the show, because his whole nature is wrapped up in a single, unforgettable episode. He arrived in the show's second season, in an episode about alien parasites. The idea of that episode is a clever and creepy one. A parasite has gotten into the family home, and this parasite spreads by planting false memories. Every time it wants to make a new copy of itself, it slips a warm, happy flashback into the minds of the family, a memory of some lovable friend or relative who has supposedly always been around. Soon the house is full of cheerful, invented people, each one backed by a flood of fond fake memories, all of them parasites wearing friendly faces. The family cannot tell who is real anymore, because everyone seems to come with a lifetime of pleasant history. The way they finally crack the problem is the heart of the episode. They realize that the parasite can only create good memories. It plants nothing but sunshine. So they reason that anyone they have a genuinely unpleasant memory about must be a real person, since the parasite is incapable of making anyone look bad. Armed with that grim logic, they begin clearing the house, sparing only the people they can recall disliking. And in the middle of that purge, they turn on the small, kindly figure of Mr. Poopy Butthole, a sweet fellow they have only ever felt warmly toward. By their own cruel rule, that warmth marks him as fake. Beth shoots him. Then the twist lands. He was real all along. The one figure they had nothing but love for turned out to be a true friend, a genuine member of their little world, and they nearly killed him for the crime of being likable. He survives the wound, barely, and the episode ends with him recovering in a hospital bed, addressing the audience directly, hurt and a little wounded in spirit as well as body, gently scolding everyone for doubting him. It is a strange, sad, funny moment, and it turned a throwaway character into an instant favorite. People loved him at once, this innocent soul who got shot for being too nice. What is easy to forget is how close he came to never existing at all. By the account of one of the show's own writers, the role in that episode was very nearly given to a completely different invented character, a figure with another name entirely, before the team landed on Mr. Poopy Butthole instead. A small choice in a writer's room, made one way rather than another, is all that stood between the world having this beloved oddity and never knowing him. The multiverse of Rick and Morty is full of roads not taken, and here was one in real life, a fork in a script that could have erased a fan favorite before he was ever drawn. After that debut, though, the show kept him on a short leash. He became a treasured presence, but a small one. He turns up now and then, often at the very end of an episode, often breaking the fourth wall to speak straight to the audience the way he did from that hospital bed. He pops in for a cameo, drops his cheerful little catchphrase, lingers for a beat, and vanishes again. The show clearly adores him, yet it never built a real story around him. He stayed a garnish, a sweet surprise sprinkled on top of other tales, never the main course. For all the love the audience had for him, the screen kept him forever in the background, a guest who never got to host. The comic decided he deserved more, and it gave it to him. In a standalone miniseries, the little figure who had only ever been a side note finally became the lead of his own adventure. The book was written by Sarah Grayley, with art by Mark Ellerby and others on the team, and it paired Mr. Poopy Butthole with one of the family members the show also tended to underuse, the eldest grandchild, Summer Smith. Summer, on the show, often gets less to do than her brother, frequently left behind, while Rick drags Morty off on the dangerous trips. Here, the comic gave both of these undervalued characters their moment, putting them at the center of a story together and letting them carry it on their own. The setup is warm and a little mysterious. Mr. Poopy Butthole has gotten himself into some kind of trouble, and when he needs help, the one person he feels he can truly trust is Summer. She agrees to help him, of course, because that is who Summer is when given the chance to matter. But a quiet question hangs over the whole thing from the start. Is he being completely honest with her? Has he told her the full truth about what he is mixed up in? Or is there something he is keeping back? That small thread of doubt, woven through a friendship, gives the story a gentle tension that the comic uses to explore the bond between the two of them. The adventure itself sends the unlikely pair out across space on a wild run of trouble. There are escapes from jail. There are vehicles seized and stolen in moments of need. There is, in a touch that grounds the cosmic chaos in something very ordinary and very Summer, a high school prom folded into the journey. The comic balances the huge and the small, the interstellar getaway against the teenage milestone, and through all of it, the real subject is the friendship at the center. The whole miniseries is built around the ideas of friendship and of fame, of what it means to be close to someone, and what it means to chase a spotlight, themes the show never had the room to hang on this particular character. That is the quiet magic of what the comic did here. The show gave Mr. Poopy Butthole a single defining trauma, and then a long string of brief cameos. The comic gave him an inner life, a problem of his own, a friend who would go to the ends of the galaxy for him, and a story where he was the one the plot revolved around. For a character whose entire screen existence was built on nearly being killed for the sin of being lovable, getting to be the hero of his own tale is a genuinely sweet gift. The page treated him as a full person rather than a recurring punchline, and in doing so, it filled in a space the show had always left empty. He is far from the only forgotten forgotten figure the comic rescued in this way. Across its run, the book made a habit of reaching back into the show's history and pulling out characters who had appeared once and then been shelved. One example often pointed to is the return of a nightmare-themed villain from the show's very first season, a parody monster who haunts dreams and who the show used in a single early adventure before largely retiring him. The comic brought him back to play with again, the way a child returns to a toy the family had packed away in the attic. Character after character who had been used and dropped found new life on the page, given second appearances and sometimes whole new roles that the show simply never got around to offering them. This pattern says something true about the different shapes of the two versions. A television show has a tight budget of time. Each season holds only so many episodes, and each episode only so many minutes, and the writers must spend that time on the stories they judge most important. Side characters, by definition, lose that competition for screen time again and again. There is always something bigger to cover. A comic, made by a separate team running alongside the show, has a looser and more generous kind of room. It can afford to spend a whole miniseries on a character the show could never justify centering, precisely because the comic does not carry the weight of being the main event. It can be the place for the smaller stories, the side trips, the spotlights on the people standing at the edge of the frame. In that sense, the comic and the show formed a quiet partnership without ever planning to. The show told the big tales, the ones that defined the family, and pushed the larger story forward. The comic gathered up everything the show had to leave on the cutting room floor, every charming face that deserved more than a cameo, and gave those faces somewhere to live. A fan who only watched the show would meet Mr. Poopy Butthole as a sweet recurring surprise, and nothing more. A fan who also read the comic would know him as someone with a real adventure to his name, a friend to Summer, a character who got to be brave and uncertain and central, rather than just adorable and absent. There is real value in that, beyond simple fan service. Giving a beloved minor character a full story honors the affection the audience already feels for them. It says that the love was not wasted, that the warmth fans felt for this little figure was worth building something around. The show created the feeling, the comic answered it, and it answered it not with a quick wink, but with a whole book, a complete journey across space and friendship, and the strange embarrassment of prom, all of it carried by a character the screen had been content to keep small. The kindness of these spotlight stories is one of the comic's gentlest gifts to the world of Rick and Morty. It took the leftovers and made them feasts. It looked at the crowd standing at the edge of the picture and walked over to ask each of them, one by one, whether they had a story to tell. Often enough, they did. That same generous instinct, the urge to look past the obvious leads and find a story in the overlooked, would soon power one of the comic's most ambitious projects of all. The book took a video game spun off from the show, a game about catching and collecting countless little Mortys, and turned it into a comic with a surprisingly large heart. What began as a tie-in to a tie-in grew into a story about the Mortys themselves, the small, frightened boys at the bottom of the whole multiverse, and what might happen if they ever decided to stop being collected and start fighting back. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. So the comic became a soft home for the show's leftovers, handing Mr. Poopy Butthole and Summer a whole space adventure of their own, and reviving forgotten faces the screen had shelved. Next, the comic built from a video game, a story that turned the multiverse of captured Mortys into a tale of rebellion. Section 6, Pocket Like You Stole It, and the Morty Uprising. Long before this story was ever a comic, it was a small game that people carried around in their pockets. The Rick and Morty world, like many popular shows, spun off a mobile game, a little thing to tap at on a phone while waiting for a bus or sitting on a couch. The game borrowed its whole shape from a much older and much more famous series about catching creatures. In that older series, a young trainer roams the land, captures strange little monsters, keeps them in tiny containers, and sends them out to battle one another. The Rick and Morty game took that beloved idea and gave it a darkly funny twist. The creatures being caught and collected and forced to fight were not monsters at all. They were Mortys. Sit with how strange that premise is once it stops being a joke. In the game, the player steps into the shoes of Rick, travels across realities, and gathers up version after version of Morty, each one slightly different from the last. There is a Morty for every theme a designer could dream of. The player builds a collection of these boys and then pits them against each other in battles, winning currency and bragging rights. Mortys as pocket monsters. The nervous, anxious grandson multiplied into an entire roster of fighters to be owned and traded and thrown into combat for sport. As a game, it is light and silly. As an idea, sitting underneath the silliness, there is something genuinely bleak about it. A whole economy built on the capture and use of frightened children. The comic that grew out of this game saw that bleak thing hiding under the fun, and rather than ignore it, the comic walked straight toward it. In 2017, the book arrived as a 5-part miniseries, released across the second half of that year. It was written by Teenie Howard, with art by Mark Ellerby, color work by Katie Farina, and lettering by the artist who signs as Crank. On paper, it was a tie-in to a tie-in, a comic based on a game, based on a show, the kind of project that could so easily have been a thin and lazy cash grab. Instead, the creative team used the chance to tell a real story, and they did it by flipping the game completely on its head. The clever heart of the comic is its point of view. The game asks the player to be the collector, the Rick who catches and commands the Morty. Mortys. The comic refuses that role. It hands the story instead to one of the collected. The lead of the book is a Morty, and his goal is not to win battles or build a roster. His goal is freedom. He sets out on a quest to free himself, and beyond himself, to free all the Mortys from the Ricks who treat them as property. The whole frame of the game gets inverted. The thing the player was meant to do for fun becomes the thing the hero is fighting to end. The captured rise up against the captors. That single change transforms everything. A game about catching boys becomes a comic about boys who do not want to be caught. The currency that the player chased in the game, the small coins won from making Morty's fight, becomes a symbol of cruelty in the comic. Proof that the Ricks see these children as nothing more than a way to make money and earn glory. Across the 5 parts, the lead Morty travels and learns. And what he learns is grim. He uncovers the dark history of Morty battling, the long, ugly story of how this practice came to be, and how deep it runs. He sees the lengths that Ricks will go to in order to win, the lows they will sink to, the way they will use and discard the very grandsons they are supposed to protect. And somewhere in that hard education, he begins to find something inside himself, a strength he did not know he had, the kind of strength it takes to stand up to the most powerful beings in the multiverse and say no. The Morty at the center of the comic is the book's own creation, marked with his own dimensional code, a label that sets him apart as a specific figure, rather than any Morty the show had already made famous. The comic's world is full of these labeled versions, and this one is the comic's own rebel, given his own number and his own story. A Rick figure features in the tale as well, tangled up in the journey in the way Ricks always seem to be tangled up in everything. But the spine of the book belongs to the Morty, the small, frightened one, who decides he has had enough. What makes this resonate is the way it touches a vein the show itself had been mining for years. The idea that Mortys are a kind of underclass, a downtrodden group living in the shadow of the Ricks, is one of the show's deepest and most uncomfortable themes. The show had explored the great hidden city where countless Ricks and Mortys live together, and it had shown plainly that in that city the Ricks rule and the Mortys serve. It had introduced the haunting figure of a Morty who turned against the whole system, a cold and clever boy who refused to stay at the bottom, and who became one of the show's most chilling presences. The notion of a Morty rebellion, of the small ones rising against the order that crushes them, was already alive in the show's bones. The comic, in 2017, was circling that same idea in its own way. It is worth being careful here about who came first, because the truth is more interesting than a simple race. The show had planted the seeds of Morty oppression early in its life, years before this comic existed, and it kept returning to them. The comic did not invent the theme. What the comic did was take that theme and pour it into a story the show would never have told, using a frame the show would never have used. The very same year the comic was running its tale of Morty liberation, the show aired one of its own most ambitious looks at the Citadel and the lives of the Mortys within it. The two were exploring kindred ground at nearly the same moment, the screen and the page each turning over the same dark soil, each finding its own crop. So rather than one leading the other, there is a sense of two siblings thinking about the same painful family secret in parallel. The show approached it through its grand canvas, its sweeping episode about an entire society. The comic approached it through the unlikely door of a phone game about catching creatures, which makes the comics version all the more surprising. It would have been so easy for a game tie-in to simply reproduce the game's cheerful collecting and leave the darkness untouched. The comic chose the harder and braver path. It looked at the premise of children being caught and forced to fight, recognized the cruelty in it, and built a story about a child refusing that cruelty. From the flimsiest possible source, a story with a real spine emerged. There was also a small physical detail to this miniseries that the show could never match, and it is a charming one. Each issue of the comic came packaged with its own set of trading cards, themed after the collecting game, featuring characters made just for this series. So the comic about catching and collecting was itself something to catch and collect. A reader did not only get the story, they got little cards to gather, new creatures and figures created especially for the book, an extra layer of the game folded into the comic about the game. It is the kind of playful, hands-on touch that lives naturally in the world of paper and ink and printed extras. A show on a screen cannot tuck a trading card into an episode. A comic can, and this one did, turning the act of reading into a small echo of the very collecting the story was questioning. The deeper meaning of Pocket Like You Stole It comes back, once again, to the difference between the two versions of Rick and Morty and what each was free to do. The show is the main stage. It carries the weight of the central story, and it spends its limited time on the tales it judges most essential. A comic spun off from a side game sits about as far from that central stage as a Rick and Morty story can get. By every normal expectation, it should have been the most forgettable corner of the whole franchise. The comic team treated it instead as a chance to say something. They found, in a children's collecting game, a story about freedom and solidarity and the courage of the small. That instinct, the refusal to phone in even the least promising assignment, is the same instinct that runs through the comic's best work, from its accidental villains to its spotlights on forgotten friends. It also shows how the comic could take the show's heaviest ideas and carry them into places the show would never go. A premise as light as a phone game became a vessel for one of the franchise's darkest themes. The contrast between the cheerful surface and the bleak heart is exactly the kind of trick the show itself loves. And here, the comic pulled it off in a format the show could not touch. The page was able to be both the game and the critique of the game at once, both the fun and the unease underneath it, holding the two together in a way that honored the strangeness of the source. For readers who came to the comic expecting nothing more than a cute companion to the app on their phone, the miniseries offered a real surprise. Underneath the familiar collecting and battling was a Morty who wanted out. A Morty who looked at the system he had been born into and decided to break it. The frightened boy at the bottom of the multiverse, the one whose whole identity in the wider world is to be used and ordered around and sent into danger, got to be a hero who fought for his own kind. In a franchise that so often treats Mortys as disposable, that is a quietly powerful thing for a comic to do, and it is the kind of thing the comic did again and again, finding heart in the places no one thought to look. The comic's willingness to wander into unlikely territory did not stop at video games. If a phone app could become the seed of a story about rebellion, then surely other worlds could be borrowed too. And the comic, freed from the limits that bound the show, soon went somewhere the screen could never follow. It walked the family straight out of their own franchise and into someone else's, dropping Rick and Morty into the middle of entirely separate fictional worlds, complete with their own rules, their own monsters, and their own legends. Those crossovers became some of the most celebrated stories the comic ever told, and they were possible only because the comic lived on the page, where two great worlds could be stitched together in a way no episode ever could. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. So the comic took a simple collecting game and turned it into a tale of captured Mortys, rising against the Ricks who owned them, finding a dark heart in the lightest of sources. Next, the comic stepped clean out of its own world, sending the family into other famous fictional lands the show could never have reached. Section 7. The crossovers the show could never make fans of almost anything eventually start to daydream about crossovers. It is one of the oldest and happiest games a person can play with the stories they love. What would happen if these characters met those characters? What if this hero wandered into that world? What if two completely separate adventures, made by different people for different reasons, somehow ran into each other and had to share a page? The daydream is sweet because it almost never comes true. Worlds tend to stay locked in their own boxes, kept apart by ownership and habit and the simple difficulty of joining them. The pleasure lives in imagining the meeting, knowing it will probably never be allowed to actually happen. The show, for its whole life, has mostly stayed inside its own box. Rick and Morty loves to reference other things. It parodies famous movies and games and stories constantly, winking at them, twisting them, building sly versions of them with the serial numbers filed off. What it rarely does is hold a real, named, official crossover, where the genuine characters of some other franchise walk on screen and share the adventure for real. The show keeps to its own universe and pokes fun at everything else from a safe distance. That habit is partly a matter of taste, since the show prefers to be its own strange thing, and partly a matter of hard practical limits that come with making a cartoon. The comic had no such limits, and so the comic did the thing the show would not. It made the daydream real. On the page, Rick and Morty step clean out of their own world and into someone else's, meeting the actual characters and rules and monsters of entirely separate franchises. These crossover stories became some of the most celebrated work the comic ever produced, and the most famous of them sent the family into the granddaddy of all fantasy adventures. That adventure was Dungeons and Dragons. For anyone who has never played it, the game is a kind of shared storytelling built around imagination and dice. A group of friends gather around a table. One person describes a fantasy world full of dungeons, dragons, treasure, and danger. The others play characters who explore that world, rolling dice to decide whether their actions succeed or fail. There are no screens needed, only paper, pencils, dice, and the player's minds. It is one of the most beloved and influential games ever made, the source from which a huge amount of modern fantasy flows, and it has been bringing people together around tables for decades. The comic crossover that joined these two worlds was announced in 2018 and published across 4 issues from that summer into the following winter. Behind it was a detail that mattered a great deal. The book was put out jointly by 2 publishers, Oni Press, which made the regular Rick and Morty comics, and IDW Publishing, which at the time held the rights to make Dungeons and Dragons comics. Neither company could have made the crossover alone. Oni had Rick and Morty, IDW had the fantasy game. By joining forces, the 2 publishers were able to legally bring the 2 worlds together, each contributing the piece it controlled. That partnership is the quiet key to the whole thing. The crossover existed because 2 companies agreed to share, an arrangement far easier to strike in the world of comics than in the world of television. The talent gathered for the project showed that nobody was treating it as a throwaway. The writing was handled by 2 strong names. One was Jim Zub, a respected comics writer who had already spent time writing official Dungeons and Dragons comics, so he knew that fantasy world inside and out. The other was Patrick Rothfuss, a celebrated fantasy novelist whose books had topped bestseller lists and earned a devoted following. Rothfuss was no stranger to either side of the crossover. He was a lifelong player of the game, having rolled dice since he was a child, and a genuine lover of the show. The art came from Troy Little, an illustrator known for adapting wild and chaotic material, with color by Leonardo Ito. This was a serious creative team, the kind assembled for a project meant to be good, not just to cash in on two popular names. The story they built begins, as so many Rick and Morty tales do, with something small and ordinary. Morty wants to learn how to play Dungeons and Dragons because it is the game all the cool kids at his school are into, and he hopes that knowing it might help him fit in. He brings this innocent wish to Rick, asking for help. And of course, in the hands of Rick Sanchez, a simple request to learn a tabletop game spirals into catastrophe. Soon, the whole Smith family finds itself swept up in a sprawling fantasy quest with no clear way out, trapped inside the very world of Dungeons and Dragons that Morty only wanted to understand. The tale is set in the time of the show's second season, slotted in after one of its early adventures, treating itself as another off-screen trip that the family supposedly took between episodes. What followed in print is a long, loving, and very funny collision of two sensibilities: the crude, cynical, science fiction energy of Rick and Morty crashing into the earnest, heroic, sword and sorcery world of high fantasy. The comic got to use real elements of the famous game, its creatures, and its lore, and its rules, in a way the show could never have done so directly, and the readers loved it. The crossover earned strong praise, and went on to be collected in larger editions, one of which was later nominated for an Eisner Award, the very honor that marks the highest level of respect in the comic world. A tie-in comic, born from a partnership between two publishers, had become acclaimed enough to stand among the best the medium had to offer that year. The crossover also did something no episode of any cartoon could ever do. It handed readers the tools to play along for real. One of the collected editions came packaged not just with the comic story, but with an actual, playable adventure for the tabletop game. There were character sheets, there was extra art, and there was a complete fantasy quest, designed by a real game designer, ready for a group of friends to sit down and play at their own table, set in a place invented for the occasion. So the comic about Rick and Morty learning Dungeons and Dragons could itself become a game of Dungeons and Dragons, played by the people holding the book. A story about a tabletop game turned into a tabletop game. That kind of hands-on gift belongs entirely to the world of print and paper. A show on a screen can show characters playing a game. A comic in a reader's hands can become the game. The success of that first crossover led to more. A sequel arrived the following year, a second 4-issue fantasy adventure that pulled the family back into the world of Dungeons and Dragons for another round, written this time by Jim Zub alongside Sarah Stern, with Troy Little returning to draw it. There was also a smaller side story that sent one of the show's strangest creations, the eager and doomed Mr. Meeseeks, on a romp through the famous fantasy realms, conquering a beloved high fantasy setting in his own chaotic way. The crossover had become a small franchise of its own, a recurring meeting of two worlds that fans kept asking to see again, and the comic did not stop at fantasy. Years later, it reached for an even older and stranger world, the world of cosmic horror. It produced a crossover pitting Rick and Morty against Cthulhu, a name that may be unfamiliar to some. Cthulhu is one of the most famous monsters in all of horror fiction, a vast, ancient, tentacled god from a set of classic horror stories written about a century ago, a creature so huge and so alien that simply glimpsing it is said to drive a person mad. Those old tales of cosmic dread have inspired countless works since, and the comic, written again by the experienced hand of Jim Zub, threw the family straight into that nightmare. The result was another collision the show would never attempt, the science fiction sitcom family stumbling into a universe of unknowable, mind-breaking horror. Each of these crossovers points back to the same truth about why the page could do what the screen could not. The reasons are practical and stack up quickly. The first is ownership. A famous world like Dungeons and Dragons belongs to other companies, and weaving it into a cartoon would mean untangling a knot of rights and permissions across television, a slow and costly and often impossible process. The comic solved this neatly by having two publishers team up, each bringing the property it already controlled. A deal between comic publishers is a far lighter thing to arrange than a deal across television studios and game companies, and so the comic could simply make the arrangement and get on with the story. The second reason is the sheer cost and slowness of animation. To put an entire fantasy world on screen in the show's style, with all its dungeons and dragons and sprawling landscapes, would mean designing and animating a whole new universe from scratch, an enormous expense of money and time for what might be a single episode. To do the same for a world of cosmic horror full of impossible geometry and monstrous gods would be harder still. A comic faces none of that. An artist with a pen can draw a dragon as easily as a doorway, a cosmic horror as easily as a kitchen. The page does not care how vast or strange the world is. It costs the same to draw a galaxy as it does to draw a garage. That freedom let the comic visit places the show could never afford to build. The third reason is the show's own nature. The series likes being its own self-contained thing. It prefers to nod and wink at other worlds from a distance, to parody rather than to genuinely cross over, keeping its own universe pure. The comic, running alongside it, was free to take the opposite approach, to throw the doors wide open and let other worlds come pouring in. The two versions ended up covering different ground precisely because they had different freedoms. The show stayed home and made fun of the neighbors. The comic packed a bag and went to visit them. Taken together, these crossovers crossovers are some of the clearest proof of what the comic added to the larger world of Rick and Morty. They let fans see the meeting that the daydream always promised, but the show could never deliver. The family at a fantasy table, the family lost in a dungeon, the family staring up at an ancient horror from the dawn of fiction. None of it could have happened on screen, tangled as it would be in cost and rights and the show's own habits. All of it happened on the page, where worlds are cheap to draw, where publishers can shake hands, and where the only real limit is what a creative team can imagine. The comic took the oldest fan daydream of all and quietly made it true, again and again. For all the spectacle of sending the family into other franchises, though, the comic had another, quieter way of expanding the world, one that did not rely on borrowed monsters or famous games at all. It opened its doors to a whole rotating crowd of writers and artists, each given the keys for a single story, each free to chase whatever small corner of the world fascinated them most. Out of that open door came a long and varied run of one-off tales, a sprawling collection of voices that gave the comic universe a breadth a tightly run show could never quite produce. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. So the comic made the oldest fan daydream real, sending the family into Dungeons and Dragons and into ancient cosmic horror, crossovers the show could never afford or arrange. Next, the comic threw its doors open to a rotating crowd of creators, a long run of one-off stories that stretched the world wider than any season could. Section 8. The Anthology Years. A television show usually speaks in a single voice. Even when a whole room of writers works on it, the show files all their ideas down into one shared tone, one steady way of seeing the world, so that every episode feels like it came from the same place. That sameness is a strength. It is what lets a series feel whole, what makes the 100th episode still feel like the same show as the first. But it is also a kind of fence. A single voice, however clever, can only sound so many ways. There are stories it will never think to tell, and angles it will never think to take, simply because they fall outside the one personality the show has settled into. The comic found a way around that fence, and it did so by doing the opposite of what a show does. Rather than smooth every contributor into one voice, it threw the doors open and invited many voices in, one at a time. Starting in 2018, alongside its regular series, the comic launched a separate line built entirely on this idea. It was a run of one-off stories, each one standing alone, released a few times a year over a long stretch. The line carried a simple and inviting promise, printed right at the top of each issue. It offered to reveal the secret stories and hidden pasts of the show's beloved characters. Where the show kept things moving forward, this line stopped and looked back, digging into who these characters used to be and where they came from. The shape of the project was its whole point. Each issue handed the keys to a different creator, or a different pairing of writer and artist, and let them tell one complete story about a single character or idea. One issue might belong to one writer with one vision, and the very next issue would belong to someone else entirely, with a different style, different jokes, and a different way of seeing the world. The result was a kind of rotating stage, a showcase where talent after talent could step up, take a turn under the spotlight, and then step aside for the next. No single voice ran the whole thing. The variety was the design. The roster of creators who passed through that stage was wide and full of interesting names. The very first issue, a look at a team of superheroes from the show, was handled by the writer Jay Torres, working with the longtime series artist C.J. Cannon. The second, a portrait of a cheerful assassin, came from the writer Mallory Ortberg, again with Cannon on art alongside a guest colorist. Over the years, the line drew in writer after writer, among them Tinny Howard, who had already proven herself on the Morty Rebellion story, along with James Asmus, Magdalene Visaggio, Delilah Dawson, Stephanie Phillips, Michael Moresi, and Alex Firer, who would later go on to lead the comic's whole relaunch. Each brought a different sensibility. A show could never assemble such a parade of separate voices and let each one speak in turn. A comic anthology could do exactly that, and this one did, for years. What those voices chose to write about is where the line earned its name. The show, over its run, had introduced a huge cast of strange and memorable side figures, used each of them for a scene or an episode, and then mostly moved on, leaving their histories blank. The anthology went straight for those blanks. It gave a full spotlight to the superhero team the show had parodied, tracing their twisted and tangled history in a loving send-up of old superhero comics, complete with the kind of needlessly complicated backstory those comics are famous for. It turned to the galaxy-roaming assassin the show had introduced and quickly killed off, the one who loved killing more than anything, and built a whole strangely sweet story around him, exploring how Rick came to know him and what made such a cheerful murderer tick. The line kept reaching deeper into the show's edges. It told a story about Rick's old band, a group from his wild past that the show had only shown in glimpses, the band that once included his closest friends. It gave a full issue to Unity, the strange collective mind that Rick once loved, a being made of countless joined people, a relationship the show had treated as one of Rick's most revealing and most painful. It spotlighted Bird Person, the loyal bird-like warrior who is perhaps the most important friend Rick ever had, a figure central to the show's deepest emotional moments. It looked at the great council of Ricks, the ruling body of the the Ricks, and at the family dog who once gained terrible intelligence, sending that dog into an all-out war against squirrels. It even gave a turn to Rick's watery rival, the Lord of the Ocean, exploring the roots of a feud the show had introduced with a wink and never fully explained. Smaller and stranger figures got their moments too. The parasite, who had briefly posed as a member of the family in the show's memory-bending episode, received his own quiet spotlight. The doomed, helpful creatures called Meeseeks, who exist only to complete a task and then vanish, got a story of their own. Even Jerry, the eternal loser, was handed issue after issue across the line, his small, sad life examined again and again from new angles. Across the whole run, which stretched to more than 24 issues over roughly 6 years, the anthology built up an enormous shelf of side character lore, a deep library of hidden pasts and secret origins that existed nowhere in the show. This is where the line connects most directly to the larger story of what the comic changed and added. The show created these characters, but left their pasts mostly empty, used them for a purpose, and then set them down. The anthology came along behind and filled those empty pasts with invented history. It decided where the assassin learned to love killing. It decided how the superhero team came together. It decided the shape of feuds and friendships the show had only sketched. None of these histories came from the show's own writers. They came from the rotating crowd of comic creators, each inventing the backstory as they saw fit. So a whole layer of origin and lore was added to the world, an entire hidden history, written by hands other than the show's. And because so many different hands were doing the inventing, the histories did not always agree, which is the most telling part of all. The anthology did not only differ from the show, it sometimes differed from itself. There is a clear and documented case in the very issue about the cheerful assassin. That one-off story offers an account of how the character got his name, yet the comic's own main series, in a separate issue, had already given a different account of the same thing. Two corners of the comic, written at different times by different people, told two versions of one small fact, and the two versions did not line up. The hidden past the comic was busy inventing turned out to have more than one version, depending on which issue a reader happened to pick up. That little contradiction is a perfect small picture of the whole situation. The comic was generating its own canon, its own pile of backstories and secret origins, faster and looser than any single tidy authority could keep track of. These invented pasts were the comic's own creations, sitting in the space the show had left blank, and the show was always free to ignore them, or to fill that same blank space with something completely different whenever it pleased. A backstory, invented for a character in a comic one-off, has no power to bind the show. The show might someday explain that same character in a way that flatly contradicts the comic, and nothing would be broken, because the comic's invented history was never the official last word. It was one possibility among many, offered up by one creator on one turn at the rotating stage. There is a real beauty in this looseness, and also a real cost, and honesty means naming both. The beauty is the richness. A fan who reads the anthology comes away knowing these side characters far more deeply than the show alone could ever allow. With a head full of origins and secret chapters and quiet character moments the screen never had time for, the world feels bigger and more lived in. The cost is that none of it is solid ground. The past the comic invented can be overwritten, contradicted, or simply set aside by the show or even by the next comic. The lore is generous, but it is sand rather than stone, and a careful reader learns to hold it gently. It is worth pausing on what the show gives up by leaving those pasts blank in the first place, because the choice cuts both ways. A blank past can be powerful. Some of the show's most haunting figures are haunting precisely because so much about them is left unsaid. Mystery has its own weight. By refusing to explain everything, the show keeps certain characters strange and unknowable, and that strangeness is part of why they linger in the mind. The anthology, in rushing to fill every blank with invented detail, trades some of that mystery for richness. Whether that trade is worth it depends entirely on what a given reader wants from the world. Some prefer the deep, filled-in lore of the comic. Others prefer the cool, unexplained edges of the show. The two versions simply offer different pleasures. What cannot be argued is the scale of what the anthology built. Over its long run, it added more side character history to the world of Rick and Morty than the show has produced in all its seasons combined. An entire parallel library of hidden pasts, written by a small army of different voices. It is the comic at its most generous and most sprawling. A project that could only exist in a form where many creators can each take a turn, where a single character can carry a whole standalone issue, and where the absence of one controlling voice becomes a feature rather than a flaw. The show speaks in one voice, carefully kept. The anthology spoke in dozens, each for a moment, and out of that chorus came a depth of world building the screen was never built to provide. For all that the anthology stretched the world outward in terms of character and history, the comic was also quietly changing the world in a smaller and more seasonal way. It began marking moments on the calendar that the show, even after years on the air, had still never touched. It threw the family a Halloween. It rang in a new year with them. It celebrated holidays the screen had simply never gotten around to, and in doing so, it shaped how the world felt in ways that went beyond any single character or plot, reaching instead into the very texture and rhythm of the year. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps helps the channel tremendously. So the comic opened a rotating stage for dozens of creators, building a vast library of secret pasts for the show's side characters, lore so plentiful, it sometimes even contradicted itself. Next, the smaller seasonal changes, the holidays and the textures the comic gave the world long before the show ever did. Section 9. Holidays, art, and tone. Holidays have a quiet power over the stories people love. There is something special about the seasonal episode, the one where a beloved show pauses its usual business to mark a day that the audience is marking too. The Halloween episode, with its costumes and scares. The winter holiday episode, with its warmth and family chaos. The New Year episode, with its parties and its hopes. These episodes become traditions of their own, the kind of thing fans return to every year because they fold the show into the rhythm of real life. They make a fictional world feel like it lives in the same calendar as the people watching it, celebrating the same days, feeling the same turn of the seasons. For a very long time, the show simply did not do this. Across season after season, year after year, Rick and Morty largely ignored the calendar. There was no real Halloween episode to speak of, no proper celebration of the new year. The show kept its focus on its adventures, and its family drama, and its endless trips through the multiverse, and it rarely paused to notice what day it was on Earth. The world of the show floated a little outside of time, untethered from the holidays that shape an ordinary year. That absence was easy to overlook, but it was there, a small empty space on the show's calendar that stayed empty for ages. The comic noticed that empty space, and the comic filled it. In a development that surprised many fans, the first proper holiday celebrations in the entire history of the franchise arrived not on the screen, but on the page. In 2024, the comic released a Halloween special, a standalone one-off that finally gave the family a real Halloween, full of the costumes and frights the holiday calls for. The following year brought a New Year special, a one-off built around the turning of the calendar, letting the family ring in a new year for the very first time anywhere in the franchise. The page reached these familiar, cozy traditions before the screen ever did. These were not the only seasonal stories the comic produced in that stretch. Around the same time, the comic put out a cluster of one-offs tied to different times of the year, including spring break specials and a sprawling holiday extravaganza built around the winter season. The comic, in short, went on a small spree of folding the family into the calendar, marking holiday after holiday, season after season, in quick succession. For a franchise that had spent years floating outside of time, this was a real shift in feeling. Suddenly, there were Rick and Morty stories for Halloween, for the New Year, for spring, for the winter holidays. The world finally had a calendar, and it was the comic that gave it one. There is a gentle irony worth noting here. By the time the comic was busy handing out holidays, the show itself had finally begun inching toward the same idea. Around its 8th season, the show started promising its own seasonal episode, a holiday-themed adventure tied to spring. So the screen was, at last, beginning to notice the calendar too. But the comic had gotten there first. Once again, the page reached a place before the show arrived, doing the seasonal celebration that the screen had skipped for years, and doing it while the show was still only promising to try. The pattern that runs through so much of this story repeats itself in miniature, the comic stepping into territory the show had left untouched, simply because it could. Why does a holiday special matter so much? It changes the texture of a world. A story tied to a holiday carries a different feeling than an ordinary adventure. It comes wrapped in the warmth and the strangeness of the season, in the shared rituals the audience knows from their own lives. Giving the family a Halloween, a New Year, a winter celebration makes the whole world feel more lived in, more human, more like a place where time actually passes and seasons actually turn. The comic, by marking these days, deepened the sense that this is a real, ongoing world rather than a string of disconnected adventures. That is a quieter kind of change than inventing a villain, but it reaches into something fundamental about how a world feels to spend time in. Beyond the calendar, the comic changed the world in an even more basic way, one visible on every single page. It looks different from the show. The art of the comic is its own thing, drawn by hand rather than animated, and that simple fact gives it a distinct character. The early issues carried the clean, lively style of the artist C.J. Cannon, and across the years, the steady hand of Mark Ellerby gave much of the line its look, a crisp and cartoony style that captured the show's designs while remaining clearly the work of a comic artist rather than an animation studio. The family on the page is instantly recognizable. Rick's wild hair, Morty's nervous slump, the green of the portal, yet it is rendered in the flatter, stiller language of ink on paper, a version of the familiar designs translated into a new medium. That difference in medium shapes the whole experience of taking in a story. Watching the show is something that happens to a viewer at the show's own pace. The images move, the voices speak, the moment arrives, and then it is gone, sweeping forward whether the viewer is ready or not. Reading the comic is something a reader controls. A reader sets the pace. A reader can linger on a single panel, study the way an artist drew a face, go back and read a page again, sit with a joke until it fully lands. The art holds still and waits. That patience changes how the humor and the feeling work. A visual gag in the comic can be examined for as long as a reader likes. A detail in the background can be hunted down. A quiet emotional beat can be held rather than rushed past. The page offers a slower, more controllable way into the same world. The art also carries the freedom that made the crossovers possible, the simple truth that a pen can draw anything for the same cost. An animated show must build and animate everything it shows, an expensive and slow process. A comic artist can draw a vast alien city or a tiny kitchen with equal ease, can render a cosmic horror or a quiet family dinner in the same afternoon. That freedom shows up not only in the big crossover spectacles, but in the everyday texture of the comic, in its willingness to draw strange and sprawling things that an animated budget might shy away from. The look of the comic is shaped by the fact that, on the page, imagination is the only real limit. The comic stretched its own look, the furthest in one particularly bold project, a line that reimagined the whole world in a completely different visual language. Starting in 2023, the comic produced a version of Rick and Morty, drawn in the style of Japanese manga, the distinctive form of comics that comes from Japan, with its own conventions of expression, motion, and design. In this manga line, the familiar characters were redrawn through that entirely different artistic lens, given the large eyes, the dramatic angles, and the particular energy that the manga style is known for. It is the single greatest visual departure the comic ever made. The family translated not just from screen to page, but from one whole tradition of drawing into another. A fan picking up the manga sees a Rick and Morty that looks unlike anything the show has ever produced. The same characters, filtered through a foreign and striking visual grammar. The comic, having its own look already, went on to prove that the world could wear many looks, that the family could be drawn in styles the show would never adopt. Tone, too, drifted on the page in ways that set the comic apart. The comic captured the show's humor, the same dark and clever and absurd sense of fun, and by many accounts it matched that humor closely, never softening the jokes for being in a different medium. Yet within that shared spirit, the comic had room to wander. It could be sillier in places, looser, more willing to chase a small strange idea just for the joy of it. It could be gentler and more openly sweet at times, leaning into warmth in a way the show sometimes resists. The short backup strips, tucked into the early issues, gave the comic a relaxed, playful texture, little side jokes, and quiet moments, with no pressure to carry a whole episode. The comic, free of the show's need to be the main event, could afford to be more casual, more experimental in its moods, drifting between tones as each creator saw fit. All of these changes, the holidays and the art and the pace and the tone, are quieter than the big inventions covered earlier. They do not announce themselves the way a new villain or a famous crossover does. A reader might not even consciously notice them, yet together they shape something deep, which is the very feel of the world. The calendar the comic gave it, the hand-drawn look that holds still and waits, the reader-controlled pace, the manga experiment that proved the family could be drawn in any style, the loose, wandering tone of the backup strips, and the one-offs. These are the texture of the comic, the atmosphere a reader breathes while turning the pages, and that atmosphere is genuinely different from the one the show creates. Two versions of the same world, one that moves and speaks at its own speed, and one that lies still and lets a reader set the rhythm. In the end, this is part of why the comic was worth making at all. A tie-in that merely copied the show, that aimed only to feel exactly like an episode in print, would have little reason to exist. The comic justified itself by feeling like its own thing, by offering pleasures the show could not, the chance to linger, the hand of an individual artist, the strange beauty of seeing the family redrawn in a wholly foreign style, the cozy novelty of a Rick and Morty Halloween. None of these replace the show. All of them add to the world around it, giving fans a second way to spend time in a place they love, a way with its own light and its own pace and its own seasonal warmth. The comic kept finding new ways to extend and reshape that world, right up to its most recent chapters. After the original run ended, the story did not simply stop. A whole new era began, a fresh start that reset the comic and pointed it in a new direction, bringing back old faces in surprising ways and asking, once more, what the page could do that the screen could not. That new beginning, and the question of where the comic stands today, is the final piece of this long story. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. So beyond plots and villains, the comic reshaped the very feel of the world, giving it holidays, a hand-drawn look, a reader's own pace, and even a manga reimagining the show would never attempt. Next, the final chapter, the comic's fresh start, and where the whole strange parallel story stands today. Section 10. The relaunch and where the comics stand now. In a world built on infinite chances, an ending is never quite the end. That idea sits at the very center of Rick and Morty, where death is a door rather than a wall, where a finished story in one reality is only an unfinished one somewhere else. The comic lived by that idea too. When its original run finally drew to a close in the spring of 2020, reaching its 60th issue, after 5 long years of monthly adventures, it would have been easy to assume the paper version of this world had simply run its course. 60 issues is a full life. The shelf was packed. The story, by any normal measure, was over. It did not stay over. After a pause of a few years, the comic came roaring back with a fresh start, a brand new beginning that reset the numbering and pointed the whole project in a new direction. The relaunch arrived in 2023, built to welcome both longtime readers and newcomers who had never picked up a single issue before. At its helm welcome was a new lead writer, Alex Firer, who had already done work within the comic's wider world and now took charge of the main series itself. A new era had begun, and it opened with one of the strangest and most ambitious premises the comic had ever tried. The relaunch carried the title of the Space Shake Saga, and the story behind that odd name shows the comic still doing the very thing it had always done best. It imagines a reality where the greatest mind in all the multiverse does not belong to Rick Sanchez at all. The supreme intelligence of the universe, in this tale, is Goldenfold, a character the show had only ever used as a small recurring figure. On the show, Goldenfold is Morty's old high school math teacher, a sleepy, ordinary man who teaches math and otherwise fades into the background. The comic took that forgettable teacher and lifted him to the top of all creation, recasting him as a cosmic power who looms over every reality. The threat he poses is built, fittingly, out of mathematics. The Goldenfolds, as the story calls them, wield the crushing power of math itself, chasing a kind of mathematical perfection and seeking to dominate the multiverse in its name. Around that towering premise, the comic gathers a cast of new faces. There is a reluctant niece named Noelle, pulled into the family business of conquest against her own wishes, a figure caught between love and obligation. There is a slick and modern stranger who keeps trying to wedge himself into Rick's life, desperate to become his new best friend, his real motives left murky and suspicious. And beneath all the cosmic stakes runs something small and very human and very Rick, a stubborn quest for the perfect milkshake, the ideal drink that gives the whole saga its name. The universe may be ending under the weight of mathematics, and Rick may still mostly care about getting his milkshake exactly right. Look closely at that premise, and the comic's oldest instinct is right there at its heart. Taking a minor character from the show, a face the audience barely remembers, and blowing them up into something enormous. It is the exact move that gave the comic Doofus Jerry, the loser turned tyrant born from a typo. It is the move that powered the long anthology line, with its spotlights on assassins and side characters and forgotten friends. Now, at the start of its new era, the comic reached for that move again, grander than ever, and turned a sleepy math teacher into the supreme ruler of all realities. The relaunch was new, but the spirit driving it was the same spirit that had run through the comic from the beginning. Find the overlooked and make it matter. The new era did not forget its old creations either. The villain born from an accident came back. Doofus Jerry, the one Jerry in all the multiverse to ever beat Rick in a fight, resurfaced in the relaunch, revealed to be alive after all, and gathered among a collection of Rick's old enemies for a great brawl. He clashed with a strange opponent in the chaos, before slipping away once more, his ultimate fate left hanging. He turned up again in the special material the comic produced to mark its 10th anniversary, proof that the typo from years before had earned a permanent place in the comic's world. A character the show itself had once tipped its hat to was still going, still alive, still causing trouble, years after his first appearance. The accident had become an institution. That 10th anniversary is worth dwelling on because of what it says about how far the comic had come. In 2024, the wider Rick and Morty world celebrated a full decade since the show first aired, and the comic marked the occasion in its own way, with large collected omnibus editions gathering up its long history and with special one-off issues made for the milestone. Cast your mind back to where this whole story started. Tie-in comics, for a long time, were treated as throwaway products, the kind of thing serious fans dismissed without a glance. The Rick and Morty comic began as exactly that sort of doubted project, a licensed book walking in behind a hit show. A decade later, it was being celebrated with anniversary omnibus collections and special editions, a respected and beloved body of work with its own history worth honoring. The doubted tie-in had grown into something that could stand proudly on its own anniversary, and the comic did not stop there. It kept going right up to the present. New one-offs and new miniseries continued to appear, carrying the family into fresh adventures, marking more holidays, telling more strange stories. The paper version of Rick and Morty remained alive and active, still wandering, still finding new corners of the world to explore. After more than a decade, 2 full runs, dozens of miniseries, a sprawling anthology line, a manga reimagining, and a parade of crossovers and specials, the comic was still adding to its own long shelf. The thing that began in 2015 as a way to feed hungry fans between seasons had become a lasting and living part of the franchise in its own right. Standing back now, at the end of this long walk, the whole shape of what the comic changed and added comes into view. It began as a story humbly walking in behind a hit show made by a separate team with the show's blessing. It opened by stepping sideways into a reality of its own, a world called C-132, set apart on purpose so it could roam free. Then it changed its mind and merged into the show's loose canon, claiming the real family, while keeping nearly all of its freedom, since the canon it joined was so relaxed that it bound almost nothing. From that freedom flowed everything else. The comic invented a villain so good, the show reached back and borrowed him, a single rare moment of the screen honoring the page. It gathered up the show's forgotten side characters and gave them the spotlights the screen never had time for, handing whole adventures to a beloved oddity and a sweet little friend who had only ever been a cameo. It took the flimsiest possible source, a phone game about catching children, and pulled from it a real story about rebellion and freedom. freedom. It made the oldest fan daydream come true, sending the family clean out of their own world and into the lands of high fantasy and ancient cosmic horror, crossovers the show could never afford or arrange. It opened a rotating stage for dozens of creators and built from their many voices a vast library of secret pasts, lore so plentiful it sometimes even contradicted itself. It gave the world a calendar full of holidays the show had skipped for years, a hand-drawn look that holds still and waits, a reader's own pace, and even a version of the family drawn in a wholly foreign style. And when its first life ended, it began again, taking a sleepy math teacher and crowning him the ruler of all realities. Through all of it, one honest truth holds the whole thing together. The question of whether the comics truly count, whether they really happened inside the show's world, matters far less than what they actually offered. In a franchise this loose about its own history, where the show breaks its own rules for a joke and swaps its own characters without ceremony, chasing a perfect, unbroken canon was always a fool's errand. What the comics offered was never about being official. It was about being a second home for a world that fans did not want to leave. A home built by people who clearly loved the show and who used the freedom of the page to do everything the screen could not. The comics are best understood as a companion to the show rather than a copy of it, a sibling sharing the same world, going its own way, finding its own corners, telling the stories the show never had room to tell. For the fan who only ever watched the episodes, none of this is required. The show stands complete on its own, and it always has. But for the fan willing to pick up the page, there is a whole second version of this world waiting, wider in some ways than the show itself, full of villains and friends and adventures that exist nowhere else, marked by holidays the screen forgot and drawn in styles the screen never tried. The comics changed the world of Rick and Morty by gently expanding it, by filling its empty spaces, by daring to do the things the show left undone. They walked in behind the show all those years ago, quiet and doubted, and then, slowly and steadily, they wandered off to build something all their own. A paper multiverse running alongside the animated one, free, strange, generous, and still going.
If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.